She spent 3 days making that cake. 3 whole days. By hand. Blue frosting. 3 layers. Because her little boy was turning 5 and she needed everything to be perfect. And then right in front of 35 people, her husband grabbed the back of her head and pressed her face into it. Slow, deliberate, like a message being delivered in public. His girlfriend was already recording, already smiling. His mother crossed her arms and said one word. Finally. 34 adults stood there and did nothing. The only person who ran to her was her 5-year-old son. But here's what none of them knew. Not the husband, not the mother-in-law, not the girlfriend with her phone already rolling. The woman standing there with blue frosting dripping down her face was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the American Southeast. And she had walked away from every penny of it years ago because she wanted to be loved for who she was, not for what she came from. What she did next didn't just change her life, it changed every single person in that room. Stay with me, because this story isn't about revenge. It's about what happens when a woman finally remembers exactly who she is and decides that the people who forgot deserve a reminder. The quietest woman in the room is often the one holding the most power. She's just waiting for the right moment to use it. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or made to feel small by someone who was supposed to protect you, this story is for you. Drop a right now, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that bell because next week we have another one that will absolutely stop you in your tracks.
What is important is what I saw happen at a little boy's birthday party in Nashville, Tennessee, on a Saturday afternoon in September. I've told a lot of stories in my life, stories about shocking betrayal, about men who truly believed they were untouchable, and about women who were pushed down so far that the people around them forgot they were standing on another human being. But I have never told a story quite like this one, because this one has a very different ending. Here's where it all begins. A backyard in southwest Nashville. 35 people, a 3-layer vanilla cake with blue frosting that a mother spent 3 days making herself for her son. Streamers were hung from a pecan tree. Dinosaur napkins were folded on a card table. 5 candles were burning in the September air. The little boy blew them out in a single breath, and everyone clapped. And then, right there in front of every single person in that yard, the boy's father grabbed the back of his wife's head and pushed her face directly into that beautiful cake. It wasn't a quick shove or a moment of anger he could blame on drinking. It was slow, deliberate, and controlled, like he was hand-delivering a message. Blue frosting went everywhere, all over the tablecloth. It covered her eyes, her nose, or her mouth. Her hands flew forward, gripping the edge of the table as her whole body went stiff. The yard fell completely silent in less than 2 seconds. His girlfriend raised her phone and hit record, smiling before the camera was even focused. His mother crossed her arms. She gave a single, slow nod and turned to the woman next to her, whispering one word, finally. 34 adults stood there like statues. Not a single person moved. Not one person said, stop. Not one of them reached out to the woman with blue frosting dripping from her chin. The only person who moved was the birthday boy. He was just 5 years old. He launched himself out of his chair and ran across the grass, both of his little arms outstretched. He stumbled on the bumpy ground, reaching for his mother's face, trying so hard to wipe the frosting away with his tiny hands. "Mommy? Mommy, Mommy?" His little voice cut through that terrible silence like a crack spreading through glass. She lifted her head very slowly. She didn't scream. She didn't swear or throw a single thing. She simply reached down, picked up her son, and wiped his tears away before she even thought about clearing a single bit of frosting from her own face. Then she walked inside. The screen door closed quietly behind her. Her husband turned back to his guests. "She's fine," he announced. "She's always being dramatic. Now, before I tell you what happened next, before I reveal who this woman really was and what she did about this whole nightmare, you need to understand something very important. This story doesn't begin in that backyard. It actually starts 12 years earlier in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina on a 400-acre estate. It was a place surrounded by ancient oak trees and morning fog. A young woman named Clare made a decision that everyone who knew her thought was completely foolish. A decision that would take 10 long years, a shattered marriage, a bathroom floor, and a ballroom full of just the right witnesses to finally prove it was the bravest thing she had ever done. She was right that love was worth more than a family name. But she was also about to spend the next decade of her life learning the true and painful cost of that belief. Clare Harrington grew up on land that had been in her family for 3 generations. This wasn't the flashy kind of wealth, not the kind you see in magazines or on reality television. It was the old kind. It was the quiet kind. Rolling green pastures just outside of Asheville, a stoned fountain at the end of a long main drive, and a library inside the house with more books than the local county branch. It was the kind of wealth that never has to prove anything to anyone, because it has always been sure of exactly what it is. Her father, George Harrington, was the 3rd generation to look after it all. He wore simple clothes and drove a pickup truck with a dent over the rear left wheel that he never got around to fixing. He knew every person who worked for him by their first name, by their children's names, and by the private worries that kept them awake at night. He raised Clare all by himself after her mother, Margaret, died from an aggressive cancer when Clare was only 7 years old. He taught her how to cook. He taught her how to care for the garden. He taught her that kindness was really a form of intelligence, and that cruelty was always, without any exception, a sign of fear. Every Sunday evening, George and Clare would sit together on the back porch of the estate, and he would tell her stories about Margaret, how she could walk into a noisy room and without a single word make everyone feel calmer just by being there, how she would laugh at things that didn't seem funny at all and somehow make them worth laughing at. When Clare turned 8, George sat her down at their kitchen table and placed a small jewelry box in front of her. Inside was a thin silver bracelet with a tiny compass charm. It was Margaret's. He had kept it inside his coat pocket since the day she passed away. He carefully fastened it around Clare's small wrist and said, "This compass belonged to your mother. She wore it every single day of her adult life, not because she needed it to find her way, but because it was a reminder that she always had one, no matter how lost things might have felt. She had a direction, and so do you, Clare Bear, always." Clare never once took that bracelet off, not in 26 years. When Clare turned 22, she made a decision that baffled almost everyone who loved her. She told George she wanted to leave, not the estate, not her family. She wanted to leave the name. She sat at that same kitchen table, the very same one where he had put the compass bracelet around her wrist. She told him what she had been practicing for months. "Daddy," she said, "I want to be loved for who I am, not for what I come from, not for my last name, and not for the number in some bank account. I want someone to choose me, just me. And I want to know, for the rest of my life, that it was absolutely real." George was quiet for a very long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, one of the horses shifted in its paddock. The afternoon sun came through the window at that special angle you only see in October. Then he finally said, "You know what that is going to cost you, don't you?" "Yes, sir." "You know there are people in this world." who will see your open heart as an open door. Yes, sir. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. He set up a trust fund in her name, untouched and silently growing, and he told her, "The door to home is always open, Claire Bear. Day or night, you never have to explain yourself. You just have to walk through it." She packed a single bag. She drove her old Honda Civic across the Tennessee state line and right into Nashville. She changed her public last name to Whitmore, her mother's maiden name. It felt like a way of carrying Margaret with her without advertising where she came from. She got a job at a small catering company. She rented an apartment with a broken dishwasher. Sam, when a radiator that knocked every single night at 2 in the morning like a polite ghost. She was happy, in a way she hadn't quite expected. It was that special kind of happiness that comes from choosing your very own ordinary life. And then, 6 months after she arrived, she met Daniel Shaw. Daniel Shaw grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, about 45 minutes northwest of Nashville. He was raised in a 2-bedroom house that always felt like it was just one bad month away from disaster. His father left when Daniel was 11. His mother, Melissa, raised him and his younger sister, Sandra, on a waitress's salary, an iron will, and a deep, unshakable belief that her son was destined and for much more than Clarksville could ever offer him. Melissa Shaw loved her son in the way some mothers love their children, completely, exclusively, and usually at the expense of everyone else in his life. She told him he was exceptional. She told him he was destined for great things. She told him that the world owed him something that it just hadn't delivered yet. She said it so often, and with such powerful conviction, that Daniel absorbed it the way dry ground soaks up rain. Eventually, it became impossible to separate her belief from his own belief about himself. He was charming, genuinely charming. He had a quick smile and an easy laugh. He was the kind of guy who could talk to anyone at a party and make them feel important. To everyone, he was the most interesting person in the room. By 24, Daniel had landed a job at a luxury car dealership in Nashville, and he was great at it. Scary good. The commission checks he brought home felt like proof of everything his mother always told him. He first saw Clare at a farmer's market on a sunny April morning. She was picking out peaches. He was just pretending to look at jars of honey, trying to figure out how to talk to her. She saw right through him. With a small smile, she said, "The clover honey is better than it looks." He laughed, admitting he'd been standing there for 4 solid minutes, trying to come up with something clever to say. Claire appreciated his honesty. In her experience, real honesty was a lot rarer than most people wanted to believe. They ended up talking for 2 hours, standing right there next to a table of homemade jams. He called her that night, and she picked up. He called again the next day. He was just so funny and warm. He spoke about his dreams with this incredible enthusiasm, like pure sunshine. He wanted to open his very own dealership someday, to build something that was his. And he talked about his mother with a kind of devotion that Claire, who had adored her own father, found incredibly moving. She had no idea back then what that devotion would one day end up costing her. They dated for 14 months. He proposed on the back porch of her apartment, with a ring he'd saved up for 8 months to afford. He got down on one knee, and she said yes before he could even finish his sentence. They had a small wedding in the Tennessee hills with just 30 people. She wore her mother's dress. That little compass bracelet was on her wrist, as she said, "I do." She truly believed she had found the exact thing she'd left home to find. And she wasn't wrong about that moment. She was just wrong about how long that perfect moment would last. The first 2 years were genuinely good. Not perfect, because nothing real ever is, but good. They bought a house in a quiet neighborhood with a big backyard. It even had a pecan tree that dropped nuts all over the lawn every October. Claire planted a garden with tomatoes and basil. Daniel would tease her about it, but then he'd eat every single thing she grew. Their son, Cooper, was born 14 months after the wedding. Daniel actually cried in the delivery room, real, unashamed tears. The kind men cry when something so huge happens. They forget to act tough. He held his son for that first hour and refused to put him down. Watching him, Claire thought, this is what it's all about. And she wasn't wrong about that moment either. She was just wrong about what a few years, a lot of money, and his mother's voice would do to him. The change started in year 3. Daniel got a big promotion. First to senior sales, then floor supervisor, and then sales manager just 8 months later. His paychecks doubled, and then they tripled. He bought a brand new truck. He joined a fancy gym that cost $400 a month. He started wearing different cologne. He began caring about the labels on his shirts, but it wasn't really about the shirts themselves. None of this was wrong on its own, but Claire felt something shifting underneath it all. A kind of restlessness, a deep dissatisfaction that had nothing to do with what he had, and everything to do with what he now thought he deserved. He started coming home later. The little daily texts just stopped. He used to send her a photo of a funny bumper sticker. Now, whole days would go by without a single word. When she spoke, he started responding with this tiny pause, just a fraction of a second too long. It was the specific pause of a man deciding if your thoughts are even worth his time. She noticed every single detail. She quietly filed it all away, the way smart women do when they feel those first small tremors, hoping they're wrong, hoping the earth will just settle back down. Then his mother, Melissa, started showing up more. Melissa Shaw had never liked Claire, not from the very first Sunday dinner. She took one look at Claire's quiet way, her simple clothes, that silver bracelet, the way she listened more than she ever spoke. And she decided right then and there, this woman was not good enough for her son. So she began, slowly and systematically, to plant that idea in Daniel's head. It happened every Sunday after church, at every holiday meal, on every phone call that Daniel took in the other room. "Baby, she is holding you back," she'd say. "A man like you needs a partner on his level. You've outgrown her. I just worry you settled." His sister, Sandra, backed up every single word Melissa said, making it even louder. It was casual cruelty disguised as loving concern. Once at a family dinner, Sandra said it right in front of Claire. "You could do so much better, Daniel, and you know it." No one even acknowledged that Claire was standing right there. Not a single person flinched. And Daniel? He said nothing to defend her. That was when Claire finally understood. In this family, silence wasn't neutral. Silence was agreement. On a Wednesday in February, the 4th year of their marriage, Claire spent all afternoon making Daniel's favorite meal. She made braised short ribs with rosemary potatoes. She put Cooper to bed, lit candles, and opened a special bottle of wine. Deciding a marriage in trouble was a special occasion. She sat down and waited at 7. At 8, she put the food in the oven to keep it warm. By 9:30, she had to blow out the candles. Daniel finally walked in at 11:47. He smelled of a restaurant she'd never been to, his tie loose. He glanced at the table, at the foil-covered food, and the melted candles. "I already ate," he said. Then he walked right past her and went upstairs to their bedroom. She just sat at that table for another 30 minutes after the door closed. Then she got up, wrapped the food, washed every dish, and carefully put the wine away. She didn't cry. Not until she was in the downstairs bathroom with the water running, loud enough to hide the sound. And right here, I want to pause and talk to you because I know some of you are already thinking, why didn't she leave? Why didn't she scream at him? Why didn't she fight back? And I want to give you the honest answer because it's so important. She loved him. And real love, the kind you build your entire life around, doesn't just die on a Wednesday night because your husband comes home late, smelling like some other woman's perfume. It dies slowly. It dies in tiny pieces, in 100 small moments that, by themselves, seem like things you can explain away, things you can survive. The cruelest part of that kind of slow decay is that by the time you see it for what it is, you're already caught in it. The person you used to be, the one who could have just walked away, feels like a character from a book you read a long time ago. If you're there right now, if that Wednesday night sounds familiar, please hear me. Understanding why you stayed is not the same as accepting that you have to keep staying. 3 weeks after that empty table, Claire found a receipt from a florist in his jacket. A bouquet had been delivered to an address she didn't know. She asked him about it. Calmly, he just told her she was being paranoid. In April, she found a long strand of blonde hair on his passenger seat. It wasn't hers. She asked him again. This time, he told her she was insecure. Then in May, she picked up his phone to check the weather, and the screen lit up with a text. The contact was just 2 letters. JC. Last night was exactly what I needed, it said. Thank you for being you. She put the phone down. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her heart was not. When Daniel got out of the shower, she asked him about it directly. No hesitation. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't shame. It was a cold, flat annoyance, like she was an appointment he had forgotten to cancel. You need to stop going through my things, he said. And honestly, Claire, with everything I do for this family, you should be grateful I still come home at all. I want you to write that sentence down. Put a date on it. That is not just a man having a bad day. That is a statement about how he sees the power dynamic between you. He's telling you his presence is a gift, that you owe him gratitude, and that his loyalty is completely optional. When someone shows you who they are, you should believe them. Luckily, Claire had one true friend in Nashville, a woman named Diane Mercer. She was a 41-year-old nurse at the Children's Hospital, warm and straight-talking. The kind of friend who shows up with a casserole before you even ask for help and stays until you're really okay. They had met at a neighborhood party 3 years before. Diane handed Claire a plate of deviled eggs and said, I definitely put too much mustard in these, and I am not even sorry about it. Claire had laughed for the first time in weeks. It was Diane who called on a Thursday afternoon in June. I have to tell you something, she said, and I need you to just listen until I'm finished. Can you do that? Claire said yes. I saw Daniel's truck outside the Riverside Hotel on Tuesday night. I was driving home late. I wasn't sure it was his, so I stopped and checked the plate. She sent the picture, license plate timestamp 11:48 p.m. Claire stared at the photo for a very long time. Then she said, Thank you for telling me, and hung up the phone. She made Cooper a grilled cheese for dinner, gave him a bath, and read 2 chapters from his favorite dinosaur book. She tucked him in, kissed his forehead, and just watched him breathe for a moment. Then, she sat down in the dark at her kitchen table and started a list. You see, Jessica Caldwell didn't just stumble into Daniel Shaw's life. She marched into it with a detailed plan. At 31, she was stylish in a way that weaponized her appearance and precise like someone who'd spent years finding the weakest walls in every room. She had done this twice before with other married men. Both of them had been insecure about their status, and both were easy targets for a woman who could make them feel like the center of the universe. From each one, she took what she needed: money, access, a certain lifestyle, and then vanish the second the situation was no longer useful. She never left a forwarding address or a single thing behind. To her, those men were just chapters she planned to finish. She started at Daniel's car dealership as a finance specialist in January. Within 2 weeks, she knew his schedule by heart. Within a month, she had all of his attention, complimenting him in ways Claire never did. It wasn't because Claire couldn't, but because Claire never thought a man who truly loved you needed constant applause. Jessica saw it differently. She understood that some men don't want a partner. They want an audience. She laughed the loudest at his jokes and wore clothes that demanded to be seen. She would text him, "Good morning," before Claire even woke up, and "good night," long after Claire had gone to sleep. She made him feel, at all times, like the most powerful man in the room. But what Claire didn't know, what no one knew, was how Jessica found that dealership. 14 months before she even applied, Jessica Caldwell attended a church fundraiser. She took a table near the back and just listened as a sharp-tongued woman in pearls complained about the wrong kind of woman her son had married. That woman, of course, was Melissa Shaw, Daniel's mother. They had coffee twice after that, and then lunch. Melissa painted a picture of Daniel as a man with incredible potential, being slowly suffocated by the wrong wife. Jessica listened, asked all the right questions, and 3 weeks later, applied for a job at the dealership. Melissa made a single payment to Jessica's account a week after that, $300. The digital proof of that transfer was about to come to light. Over the next 3 weeks, Claire quietly gathered her evidence. There was the florist receipt, the photograph from Diane, and bank statements, with charges she didn't recognize. There were dinners at restaurants she'd never visited, and a hotel stay charged to their joint account on the very night she was in Asheville visiting her brother. She printed out the screenshot of the text message and organized everything into a single folder, clean, dated, and documented. And with it, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: clarity. It was the kind of clarity that feels like power because you finally have solid ground to stand on. On a Sunday morning, in late June, with Cooper at his grandmother's for the day, she sat Daniel down at the kitchen table and placed the folder right between them. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just presented the facts, like a woman who knows she is right. Daniel looked through the Stunden der Sobs, page by page. Then, he leaned back in his chair and laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was genuine, as if she had just told a hilarious joke. "Claire," he said, "what exactly do you think you're going to do with this?" She told him she was considering her options. He said, "You don't work. You have no money of your own. You don't have a career. What lawyer is going to take your case? I have a job, a mother who will testify about what kind of wife you've been, and a lawyer who owes me a big favor. So tell me again, what are you going to do?" She just held his gaze and said nothing. He picked up his phone and called Melissa, right there in front of her. "Hey, Mama, can you keep Cooper for a few days? Claire needs some time to get herself together." Melissa arrived 19 minutes later. She had Cooper's bag already packed before she even walked in the door. She had clearly been waiting for this exact call. Claire stood there and watched Melissa buckle her son into his car seat. Cooper waved from the window, confused but smiling because he was only 5. He didn't know yet that some goodbyes are much heavier than they seem. The car pulled away, and Claire stood in that doorway for a very long time. When she finally closed the door, she slid down to the floor, and she understood. This wasn't a marriage that was failing. This was a plan being carried out, and she was the only one who didn't know the rules. With Cooper gone, Daniel stopped pretending. Jessica's car was in the driveway on Tuesday, and again on Thursday. On Friday afternoon, Melissa came over, and the 3 of them sat on the back porch, eating takeout on the very table that Claire had found at a garage sale. She had repainted it herself one weekend that spring. That Saturday, a photo appeared online, family dinner at a steakhouse. There was Daniel, Melissa, his sister Sandra, and Jessica, all tagged, all laughing. No Claire, no Cooper. It was a brand new family portrait, with her and her son surgically removed. Someone from her neighborhood saw it and sent her the screenshot without a word, just the image, just the gaping hole where her life used to be. Claire called Diane. Diane came right over and found her sitting on the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinets. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just still, in that terrifying way a person gets. A person who has moved past tears into something much colder and more dangerous. I don't know how to fight this, Claire said quietly. I don't even know what I'm fighting. Diane sat down on the floor, right next to her. Then we figure it out together, she said. But first, you are going to eat, because you can't fight a war on an empty stomach. And I am not going to let you fall apart before the good part starts. Claire almost smiled at that. Almost. Cooper came home 10 days later, and Claire threw herself into planning his birthday party. She poured all her love into it, holding nothing back. She baked a 3-layer vanilla cake with blue frosting. It was Cooper's favorite color. She hung streamers from the pecan tree in the backyard and set up little chairs in a circle for his friends. She made a playlist of all his favorite songs and bought dinosaur paper plates and napkins. She even spent 45 minutes online finding the perfect T-Rex piñata. Nothing was expensive, but everything was done with so much care. She invited 35 people, neighbors, parents from daycare, and a few of Daniel's coworkers she'd always liked. She worked for 3 whole days on that cake, making sure the frosting had the perfect swirls, just the way Cooper liked them. Daniel mentioned he had invited a few people too. He just didn't mention that one of them was Jessica. He didn't tell Claire that he had told Jessica this was her moment, her chance to walk into Claire's home as if she already owned it, and Claire saw it all unfold. Jessica arrived wearing an expensive sundress and oversized sunglasses. With Daniel's hand on her arm, Melissa met her at the gate and hugged her. A long, warm hug. The kind you give someone you have been eagerly waiting to see. Claire was standing by the food table with a tray of sandwiches that she'd cut into triangles. Cooper was absolutely convinced that triangle sandwiches tasted better than square ones. She set the tray down slowly. She looked at Jessica, standing in her yard next to her husband, and she finally understood with perfect clarity. This wasn't a birthday party. It was a demonstration of power, and she was the one being made an example of. The candles were lit at 3 o'clock. 35 people gathered in the backyard that Claire had decorated with tape, love, and 3 days of careful work. The streamers fluttered in the September breeze. The dinosaur plates were stacked neatly at the end of the table. Cooper stood on a little step stool to see the cake, his face glowing from the light of 5 small candles. His eyes were wide, with that special seriousness a child has when they understand that making a wish is very important business. Claire knelt down beside him and put a hand on his back. "Make a wish, baby," she whispered. He squeezed his eyes shut so tight his whole face scrunched up from the effort. He took a huge breath and blew out all 5 candles at once. Everyone clapped. Claire smiled, a real smile, the first one all day that felt free. For just 1 second, it was simply a birthday party. Then Daniel stepped forward. He didn't yell. He didn't make a big speech. He didn't raise his voice or show any anger, which at least would have been honest. He simply put one hand on the back of Claire's head and pressed her face down into the cake. It wasn't a push, it was a press. Slow, deliberate, with the kind of force that comes from a decision made long ago. The sound was soft, like something muffled breaking underwater. Blue frosting exploded across the tablecloth. It covered her eyes, her nose, the corners of her mouth. Her hands shot out, gripping the table's edge, palms flat and firm. Her entire body went rigid. The September air felt cold on her neck, as the backyard fell silent in under 2 seconds. That's when Jessica raised her phone and hit record. Before the silence had a chance to settle, Jessica was already smiling. Not nervously, not in shock, but with the smug, satisfied smile of someone watching a plan come together perfectly. Melissa, his mother, crossed her arms. She looked at her son and nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when something you've wanted for a long time has finally happened. She turned to her friend, Sandra, and said, just loud enough for everyone to hear, finally, maybe now she will understand her place. 34 adults stood completely frozen. Not a single person moved toward Claire. Not one voice said to stop. Not one hand reached out. The only person who moved was Cooper. He screamed, "Mommy!" He launched himself from a small step stool and ran across the grass, his arms stretched out, stumbling as he reached for her face. His small hands found her cheeks, trying desperately to wipe away what had been done. "Mommy! Mommy! Mommy is—" His voice cracked through the silence like a line being driven through ice. Claire lifted her head. Blue frosting dripped from her chin as tears carved clean lines through the icing. She could feel the heat from the 35 people standing around her, none of them moving, all of them choosing to look away in their minds. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She didn't even throw a single thing. She simply reached down and picked up her son. She wiped his tears first, using the corner of her own sleeve before she even thought to clean her own face. Then she turned and walked inside, the screen door closing softly behind her. Daniel turned back to the party as if nothing had happened, like a man who had already moved on. "She is fine," he said. "She is always dramatic." Jessica rewatched the footage on her phone, sending it to her own number with a smile. Melissa assured the guests the party was still going. Sandra helped herself to a piece of the ruined cake. Inside, in the hallway bathroom, Claire locked the door with Cooper on her hip. His face was buried in her neck, his small body shaking with the effort of a 5-year-old trying to understand something his body knew was wrong, even if his brain didn't have the words for it. She stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror. The blue frosting covered her face, like a cruel mask that someone else had chosen for her. Her mascara ran in dark streaks through the icing. Her silver compass bracelet, a gift from her father, was smeared with cake. She gently cleaned the bracelet first, with the corner of a washcloth, more carefully than she cleaned her own skin. She polished the small compass charm until the silver caught the bathroom light again. She looked at her son. "Mama is okay, baby," she whispered. "Mama is always okay." But her hands would not stop shaking. 40 minutes later, Cooper was asleep on the bathroom rug with a folded towel for a pillow. Claire checked her phone. 49 notifications. Jessica had posted the video publicly. In less than an hour, it was shared to 3 Facebook groups, a Reddit thread, and a gossip page with 200,000 followers. The caption said, "When she finally gets what she deserves," followed by a laughing emoji. The comments were a mix. Some people thought it was a prank, others called Claire dramatic, and some asked, with that specific kind of online outrage, "Rin," from people who would have done the exact same thing as those 34 adults, why no one moved to help her. But they were all watching, every last one of them. They were watching Claire's worst moment. The 3 days of baking. The streamers she had hung with her own 2 hands. The triangle sandwiches she cut for a 5-year-old who believed triangles simply tasted better. All of it was now just 47 seconds of footage, traveling across the internet for entertainment. She set the phone down, then immediately picked it back up. She had to check the bank account. She needed to know if she had enough money to take Cooper someplace safe for the night. She called the automated line. The system read her balance, negative $2,340. She pressed 0 for a representative and waited on hold for 6 minutes, listening to music designed to be calming that was anything but. A man finally answered. She asked about the balance. He told her a cash advance was taken against a credit line attached to her Social Security number 3 weeks ago. It was a card she had never applied for, never activated, never even held in her hands. Ma'am, the primary cardholder authorized it using your information. Her name, but Daniel's authorization. She asked how much was on the card. $40,000 in charges. Hotels, jewelry, weekend trips, a spa visit. A bill from the very morning she had driven Cooper to his checkup alone because Daniel had something to do. Designer items were shipped to an address that was not their house. All of it in her name, all without her knowledge, all without her signature. She slid down to the bathroom floor. Her son was asleep a foot away, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a child who still trusts the world. She had no money. Her credit was destroyed, and her face was all over the internet, covered in birthday cake frosting. Frosting from a cake she made herself. And the man who arranged all of it was downstairs in her backyard, laughing with the woman he had chosen instead of her. And right here, I want to stop the story for a second. Not for drama, but because I want you to feel the specific weight of that bathroom floor. A woman with her sleeping child, no money, no plan, and no one in that backyard who helped her. The world was telling her, in every way it could, that she did not matter. But that was not the end of Claire's story. That was the floor. And the floor, as it turns out, is exactly where some people discover what they're made of. Because something happened in that bathroom, in the quiet dark, while her son slept and a faucet dripped. Something inside her that had been very still for a very long time finally stood up. At 3 a.m, Cooper was asleep beside her on the bed. His hand was curled around a toy dinosaur, his breathing slow and steady, the kind of deep rest a child finds after crying it all out. Claire lay beside him, in the dark, with her phone in her hands. She had been staring at it for 40 minutes. She scrolled to a contact she had not dialed in 4 years, not because of anger, but from the pride of a woman who made a choice and felt she had to live inside it, without her father's voice reminding her of who she used to be, George Harrington. She pressed call. It rang twice. Clare Bear. His voice was exactly the same, unhurried, steady, the voice of a man who has been standing in the same place for a long time and is never surprised by the weather. She didn't cry. She was all out of tears. What was left was something flatter, cleaner, and resolved. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you everything. And when I am done, I need you to let me decide what happens next." "Not you, me. Can you do that?" There was a pause. "Yes," he said. "Tell me everything." She talked for 90 minutes. She told him all of it. The year of small cruelties, the lonely dinners, Melissa's constant scheming, Jessica's arrival, the texts on the phone. She told him about the birthday party, the cake, the video, and the ruined bank account. Her voice stayed flat and even the whole time, clear, like a person reading facts in a courtroom. George listened without interrupting even once. When she finished, the line was silent for 10 full seconds. Then he simply said, "What do you want, Claire?" He didn't say, "I will handle this." He didn't say, "No one touches my daughter." It wasn't a promise of revenge dressed up as love. He just asked what she wanted. "I want Cooper safe," she said. "I want what he did with my name documented and addressed through every legal channel there is." and I want to walk back into my own life standing up. I am not asking you to fight for me, Daddy. I am asking you to hand me what I need and trust me to use it." There was another pause, longer this time. Then he said, "That is my girl." The following morning, Harold Pike called Clare directly. He was 64 and had been George Harrington's legal counsel for 23 years. He was silver-haired and spoke in a tone so measured that other attorneys often spent the first 10 minutes of any meeting just trying to figure out if he was taking them seriously. He was always taking them seriously. He just saw no reason to perform urgency. He asked her one question before they began. What outcome do you want? Not what she was angry about, but what outcome? She told him specifically, primary custody of Cooper, established before anything else. The credit fraud documented and reported to every authority. The video preserved as evidence of emotional abuse for the divorce. Nothing more, nothing theatrical, just the facts, placed in the right rooms with the right amount of weight behind them. Harold took some notes and then said, "Give me 72 hours. He called back in 48. "Mrs. Shaw, he started. "We've pulled Jessica Caldwell's background. The pattern of 2 prior relationships is documented, and we can use it. But there's something else." He paused. The kind of pause that means what comes next will change absolutely everything. Miss Caldwell and your mother-in-law, Melissa Shaw, have a documented relationship. It started 14 months before Miss Caldwell even worked at the dealership. We have phone records and a financial transaction. Miss Shaw made a payment to Miss Caldwell's account about a week after she applied for the job. Claire was completely quiet. Melissa didn't just tolerate the affair, Harold said. She started it. She recruited Jessica Caldwell, nurtured the relationship, and then arranged the introduction to your husband. We have all the documentation. Claire sat down slowly in a kitchen chair. She thought about every single Sunday dinner, every whispered campaign, every time Melissa had shown up at just the right moment to take Cooper, to plant another seed, positioning herself in the space between Claire and Daniel. It was like she was tending a garden she always intended to harvest. She remembered the birthday party, Melissa's crossed arms, and that one single word, finally. She hadn't been watching her marriage fall apart. She had been watching a woman deliberately dismantle her family over years, all because she had decided long ago that Claire Whitmore wasn't the right woman for her son, and had chosen to do something about it. "What do you need from me?" Claire asked. "Nothing yet," Harold said. "Just hold on a little longer." 3 weeks after the birthday party, Daniel Shaw received a special invitation. It was on thick card stock with gold lettering. The Tennessee Business Leadership Summit. Black tie at the Grand Hyatt in Nashville, with a note saying he'd been chosen for VIP recognition as an outstanding community contributor. He called Jessica from the dealership parking lot the second he read it. "Baby," he said, "we have a gala." She responded with the exact enthusiasm he had come to rely on. He bought a new tie and had his shoes resoled. He told Melissa to get her hair done. He told Sandra to find something elegant. He didn't know that George Harrington was the event's primary sponsor. He had never needed to know that name. He arrived with Jessica on his arm and Melissa at his side, and took his place at the VIP table near the front of the ballroom. There were crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, and a live band playing something soft and tasteful. 300 of the most influential people in the city of Nashville were in that one room. Daniel surveyed it all with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has finally arrived somewhere worthy of him. Melissa straightened her pearl necklace and said, "This is exactly the life you deserve, baby." Sandra took photographs for her social media accounts. Nobody mentioned Claire. Nobody thought about her. She had been erased from the evening before it even began. But that afternoon, a garment box had arrived at Diane's house where Claire and Cooper were staying. Inside was a navy gown, simple and precisely cut, the kind of dress that doesn't need decoration. Because the woman wearing it is the decoration, there was a note in George's handwriting. On a small card tucked into the tissue paper, it read, "You are the compass, Clare Bear. You always were." Diane stood in the doorway of the guest room while Claire dressed. She didn't say anything for a long moment, and then she said, "You look like someone who is about to change the ending of a story." Claire fastened the compass bracelet at her wrist. She looked at herself in the mirror. She didn't look triumphant or angry. She didn't look like a woman performing a big comeback. She looked like a woman who has walked through enough fire to know that she is not the thing that burns. At the summit, George spoke first. He did not mention Claire by name. He talked about legacy, about the difference between men who build something real and men who spend their lives performing success while quietly destroying the people standing closest to them. He talked about what it costs a family when power gets confused with cruelty. He spoke without any notes and with the unhurried authority of a man who has never needed a room to like him. The entire room listened with the focused attention of people who could feel that his words were aimed at something very specific. Then George said, "Tonight, I would like to introduce someone who has shown me more about grace under genuine pressure. With affinity usted than anyone I have known in my 67 years, my daughter." The ballroom doors opened. Claire walked in, posture straight, eyes forward, in the navy gown. The compass bracelet at her wrist was catching every light in that room. There was no performance, no expression of triumph, just a complete and unshakable stillness, the kind that comes from a woman who has finally decided she is done being small in spaces that should have always belonged to her. She did not look at Daniel's table. She walked through the center of that ballroom, and conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks were lowered, glasses paused at lips. 300 people went quiet in that particular way people do. They felt they were watching something that mattered. She climbed the stage steps and she took her father's hand. She turned and faced the room. Daniel's champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth, his brain struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. His wife, on that stage, next to that man, the man whose name was on the gold invitation, in Daniel's pocket right now. Jessica's hand slid off his arm. Her smile collapsed, not slowly, but all at once, like a building with no foundation. Melissa gripped the tablecloth with both hands, her knuckles turning white. The pearl necklace she had bought on credit felt.
Verdammt.
In that moment, very heavy and very small, Sandra lowered her phone for the first time all evening. Claire stepped up and took the microphone from her father. She held it steady. Her voice did not shake. She did not raise it. She did not need to. "I want to tell you a story," she said, "about a woman who had everything and gave it all up. Not because she was forced to, and not because she was naive, but because she believed with her whole heart that love was worth more than a last name. That being chosen for who you are is worth more than being valued for what you come from." She told it all, the choice to leave Asheville, the farmer's market,
Pessimacedi.
the man who pretended to look at Honey for 4 minutes because he could not figure out how to start a conversation. The wedding in the Tennessee hills, her mother's dress, the compass bracelet at her wrist as she said, "I do." The dinners eaten alone, the candles that melted before he came home, the receipts, the strand of hair, the text message. Being told she should be grateful he still came home at all. Her son's overnight bag, that was packed before the phone call, was even made to collect him. 3 weeks ago, she said, I stood in my backyard at my son's 5th birthday party. I had spent 3 days making a cake, blue frosting, 3 layers. My little boy blew out the candles,
Word son.
and then my husband grabbed the back of my head and pressed my face into that cake, slowly and deliberately, in front of every person I had invited into our home. The room did not breathe. His girlfriend recorded it on her phone. She was smiling before she hit record. His mother crossed her arms and nodded and said loudly enough for me to hear, "Finally, maybe now she will understand her place." And not one adult in that yard moved. She paused for 5 full seconds of silence. The only person who came to me was my 5-year-old son. He ran across the yard with both arms out, screaming my name. She let that land. That woman is me. She did not point, she did not need to. Every single head in that room turned toward Daniel's table. He sat frozen, his jaw locked, his eyes wide with the specific fear of a man who has just understood that the ground he built everything on was never actually his. Behind Claire, a screen lit up and the video played. 47 seconds, in a room full of 300 people who now knew exactly who her father was and understood the full weight of what they were watching. Every second of that footage landed like a verdict, finally delivered in the right room. No one laughed. Harold Pike stepped to a second microphone. He was calm and professional. His voice carried without being raised. He announced the formal documentation of credit fraud totaling $40,000, opened in Clare Shaw's name without her knowledge or consent. He confirmed that legal proceedings had been initiated with the Tennessee Attorney General. He noted that the property Daniel Shaw currently occupied had always been held in a Harrington family trust, and that his occupancy had been formally revoked that evening. Then he said, "Additionally, we have obtained documentation confirming that the introduction between Daniel Shaw and Jessica Caldwell was arranged deliberately by Melissa Shaw 14 months prior to Miss Caldwell's employment at the dealership, and was accompanied by a documented financial payment. This was intentional. It is documented, and it will be presented in full in the civil proceedings." The room went completely still. Melissa stood up from her chair, one hand flat on the table. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Daniel turned to look at his mother, and she just sat back down. He reached under the table for Jessica's hand, but it was not there. Jessica was already composing a text on her phone. Not to Daniel, not about Daniel. She had identified her next situation 3 weeks prior and was already managing her exit with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this enough times to have a system. She did not say goodbye. She did not look at him. In that one moment, she became someone who had already left the room. Claire placed the microphone on the podium, kissed her father on the cheek, and walked off the stage. With the same calm stillness she had walked on with, she didn't look back. The room simply parted for her, like the sea making way for the tide. Daniel Shaw was served with legal papers on Monday morning at the dealership, right in the parking lot, in front of 3 coworkers who, just 3 weeks earlier, had stood in his backyard and watched his wife walk inside, alone with frosting on her face, and they did nothing. They didn't look at him the same way anymore. They looked at him with a special kind of discomfort, the discomfort of people who know they made a choice they can't take back. Men who spent weeks quietly rewriting the memory of what they saw, just so their own silence felt a little more justified. His manager called him into the office and told him the video, now with the full context of the summit, her father George Harrington's name, and the fraud documents picked up by 2 local news stations, had gone viral again. The company had to protect its reputation. He was being placed on indefinite, unpaid leave, effective immediately. When he drove to the house, the locks had been changed. His clothes were in boxes on the porch, folded perfectly. Even his shirts were folded the right way. The collar tucked, sleeves pressed flat, just the way Claire had taught him at the farmer's market on their third date. She had laughed at how badly he was doing it and showed him the right way. That tiny detail broke something inside him more completely than any legal document ever could. He called her phone. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. Her voice on the recording was calm, unbothered. It was the voice of a woman who had already crossed to the other side of a disaster he was just beginning to fall into. He drove to Jessica's apartment, buzzed her unit. No answer. He buzzed again, then went inside to find the building manager, who told him. Miss Caldwell had moved out of the apartment 4 days ago. Completely cleared out. No forwarding address, not a single piece of furniture left behind. Not even a scent in the air. She left nothing, because to her, Daniel Shaw had only ever been a chapter she had already finished. He sat in a Walgreens parking lot with the engine off, his hands tight on the steering wheel, and just stared at nothing for a very long time. And then it hit him. Not slowly, but all at once. A wave that had been building in an ocean he never bothered to notice. What he had lost. Not the house he never truly owned, not the income, not the status. It was her, the woman who would wake up at 4 a.m. to bake a birthday cake for his son just because she wanted it to be perfect. The woman who set the table with candles on a normal Wednesday for no reason except that she loved him. Who greeted every one of his family members with genuine warmth, even when they treated her like she wasn't there. Who would touch a silver bracelet for courage and never explained what it was for. Who had a father who could buy every car dealership in the state, and she never said a single word about it. She had loved him that much. She had trusted him completely, and he had thrown it all away for a woman who was already planning her exit while she was still in his house. Melissa stopped attending her church. It happened after 3 members confronted her in the parking lot after the summit. Her Sunday school class quietly found a replacement for her. She stopped hosting holiday dinners. She stopped her daily calls to Sandra. She sat in her quiet kitchen in Clarksville long after Daniel had confronted her. The house was completely silent for the first time in 30 years of building her son into someone who only existed in her own stories. Melissa Shaw had nothing left to say. Sandra's Instagram post of the steakhouse dinner had been screenshot long before she deleted it. Screenshots live longer than regret. Her employer called her in for a meeting about company values. She deleted her social media accounts, but the digital record was permanent. It was already woven into the internet, the way a thread is woven into fabric. It was part of the structure now and wasn't going anywhere. Jessica resurfaced 6 months later in Memphis. Different city, different man, but the same exact plan. The same patience, intentions, the same practiced charm aimed right at his vulnerabilities. But this time, Harold Pike's office was waiting for it. He had already sent the complete file to a family law attorney in Memphis, at the request of that new man's wife. She had found them through a quiet network Claire helped create after she moved back to Asheville. Claire never announced it. She never publicized it. She simply made herself available to women who needed what she had once needed on a bathroom floor at 3 a.m, someone to hand them the right tool and then step away. 2 weeks after the summit, Claire packed her and Cooper's things into her old Honda Civic. It was the same car she had driven into Nashville 11 years earlier as a 22-year-old with 1 suitcase, a compass bracelet, and the belief that love was worth more than a last name. Cooper sat in the back with his toy dinosaur, his sneakers on the wrong feet, because he'd insisted on doing it himself, and she didn't have the heart to correct him. He fell asleep somewhere in the foothill, his head tilted against the window, his chest rising and falling in the easy rhythm of a child who still trusts the world enough to sleep deeply. Claire drove through the Blue Ridge Mountains as the sun rose over the peaks. The light cut through the trees in long golden bars. The road curved through the familiar hills, and she knew every turn of it, the way you know something you've carried in your bones since childhood. She touched the compass bracelet once. She did not look in the rearview mirror. The estate was just as she remembered it. The stone fountain at the end of the long drive, the oak trees along the fence, turning amber and gold in the October light, the library, the back porch. That was where George had told her stories about her mother, Margaret, on Sunday evenings, when she was small enough to believe the world was mostly good and that people mostly meant well. Cooper ran through the gardens on his first afternoon. He chased a rabbit. He collected a fistful of dandelions and presented them to Clare with the seriousness of someone giving a priceless gift. George put him up on his shoulders and walked the garden paths with him until dinner time. That evening, Claire and George sat on the back porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea, the October light falling in long gold bars across the floor. After a long while, Claire spoke. "I thought love was supposed to feel like home." George took a slow sip. He set his glass on the armrest and watched Cooper in the garden below, a small figure in the fading light, turning dandelions into treasure. Then he turned to his daughter and said, "It is, Claire Bear. You were just in the wrong house." She smiled. A small, real smile, the first one in a very long time that hadn't cost her anything. Cooper turned 6 on a Saturday in October. The kitchen in the Asheville estate was 10 times the size of the one in Nashville. Marble countertops, double ovens, and windows that let in so much morning light, the room practically glowed. The cake was a homemade vanilla sponge cake, 3 layers with blue frosting made by Claire's hands on a Friday morning. Cooper sat on the counter and tried to sneak his finger into the mixing bowl twice. He was caught both times and thought it was hilarious. It was never about the kitchen. It was never about the size of the house or the marble countertops. It was about a mother's hands making something sweet for her child, and that had not changed. It would not change. The people around the table were different now. George was at the head, with Diane and her husband across from Claire. Diane had driven up from Nashville with deviled eggs, good wine, and a cheerful refusal to make anything too sentimental. Harold Pike had sent flowers, which Cooper immediately tried to use in a game with his toy dinosaur that had very unclear rules. Cooper's kindergarten teacher, Beverly, had come. She was the woman who had called Claire 6 weeks into the school year just to say that Cooper was one of the most empathetic children she had taught in 14 years, and she thought Claire should know that. These were people who said Claire's name with warmth and meant it, who looked at Cooper and saw exactly what he was, a miracle in dinosaur sneakers, who put his shoes on the wrong feet by choice and collected dandelions like currency, and still believed with his whole heart that wishing on birthday candles was serious and important work. When the candles were lit and the room began to sing, Claire stood behind her son with her hands resting gently on his shoulders. He looked up at her, and she could see there was already frosting on his finger from a taste he had stolen when he thought she wasn't looking. She had seen him. She just said nothing. Some things are worth it. "Make a wish, Mommy," he said. She laughed a wide, unhurried, unguarded laugh, the kind that only comes after a woman has walked through fire and found out on the other side that she was never the thing that burned. She was the thing that survived. "Baby," she said, "I already got my wish." He blew out all 6 candles in one single breath. The room erupted in real applause, from people who meant it, from people who chose to be in that room, not people who were obligated to be there. The compass bracelet caught the October morning light through the window and glowed on her wrist like a small, steady star, like something that had been pointing true north all along, even in the years when she wasn't ready to follow it. She had followed it now. So, what did this story teach me? Before we close, I want to talk to you directly, not as a storyteller, just finishing a drama. I've been sitting with Claire's story for a while, really thinking about what it all means. And it turns out there are 5 powerful lessons this story taught me that I think we all need to hear. The first one is this: silence is not weakness. There's a special kind of strength that, from the outside, looks a lot like patience. It gets mistaken for being passive. It gets taken advantage of by people who think that being quiet means you have nothing to say. But Claire was never powerless. She was just waiting, whether she knew it or not, for the perfect moment. The moment the truth could finally land in the right room with the right people listening. She didn't waste her energy on every little fight, because on some gut level, she knew something important. She knew that winning all the small battles would cost her the strength to win the one that truly mattered. Her silence wasn't about fear. It was about building something. And that brings me to the second point. Love should never, ever ask you to become invisible. If your partner only seems to love you when you're smaller, quieter, or more convenient for them, that isn't love. That's all. That's control disguised as affection. And it's one of the hardest things to see when you're on the inside, because the person doing it is usually the one you've given all your trust to. The cruelty doesn't start with a bang. It's quiet. It happens in tiny increments, one small step at a time. It's a series of little moments that you can talk yourself into surviving. An empty seat at the dinner table. A holiday greeting that never comes. A cold silence where he should have defended you. And it goes on, until one day you're standing in your own backyard at your kid's birthday party. You're holding a cake that took you 3 days to make. And the man who promised to choose you is showing the entire world just how little you actually matter to him. The third lesson is for anyone who's ever stood in that backyard, saw something wrong, and chose to say nothing. Your silence is a vote. Every single time we put our own comfort ahead of someone else's pain, we cast that vote. We are telling the person being hurt, you're on your own. We make the world just a little bit colder and then lie to ourselves that it wasn't our job to make it warmer. In that entire yard, a 5-year-old boy was the only one with enough courage to run to his mother. Just think about that. Think about what that says about all the adults who just stood there watching. The next time a moment asks you to pick between what's comfortable and what's right, remember that little boy. Be braver than the adults in that yard. The fourth lesson is this: your value is not decided by what other people do to you. Daniel tried to turn Claire's love into a weapon. Melissa tried to erase her completely. Jessica treated Claire's life like a boring hallway, just something to pass through to get to a better room. And through every bit of it, Claire's worth never changed, not even a little. It was always there, it was always hers, and it was always real. The only real question was when she would finally decide to claim it again. Now, the fifth thing, and this is the one I really want you to take with you, is that the woman people underestimate today is so often the one they have to answer to tomorrow. Not through luck, and not because her dad had money. It's because she never, ever stopped being who she was, even when it cost her absolutely everything, even when she was on a bathroom floor at 3 a.m, with her sleeping child on her chest, and nothing left in a bank account that someone else had completely drained. Even then, she knew who she was. You see, the compass bracelet didn't point north because it was a pretty piece of silver. It pointed north because she finally made the choice to follow it. And that inner direction is something that nobody, no husband, no mother-in-law, no paid intruder, no viral video, and no lawyer's statement sent at 9 at night can ever take away from a woman who has decided to remember her own strength. So before you judge a person's silence, think about what they might be building. Before you underestimate the quiet woman in the room, consider what she already knows that you don't. And if you are that woman right now, and this story felt less like a story and more like looking into a mirror, I need you to hear me. You are not at the end of your story. You've just hit the floor. And the floor, it turns out, is the perfect place to find out what you're really made of. If this story stuck with you, if Claire's journey felt real, or it reminded you of someone you love, please share it. Do it today, because someone you know might be on their own bathroom floor right now. They might need to hear that the floor isn't the end, that the quiet woman has a voice, and that the compass still points north, even when everything else has fallen into total chaos. Please subscribe to this channel. Every week, we share stories just like this one. They're stories about a quiet kind of strength, about consequences that build up slowly until they arrive all at once. They're about people who found their way home to themselves when the world gave them every single reason to get lost. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss a thing. And if you've ever been the person in that backyard who froze when you should have acted, it is never too late to choose differently next time. That is the entire point of the stories we tell here. I will see you in the next one. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
So, here we are at the end of Claire's story, and I want to sit with you here for just a moment, not as a narrator wrapping up a tale, but as someone who has been carrying these lessons around ever since the first time I told it. Because this story isn't just entertainment. It never was. It was always about something deeper, something that a lot of people are living through right now, quietly, alone, in their own version of that bathroom floor. So let me tell you what I believe this story was really about. We live in a world that rewards the loudest voice in the room, the person who pushes back the hardest, the one who makes the most noise. We've been taught that if you don't fight back immediately, visibly, publicly, you've lost. Claire never believed that, and she was right. She didn't scream at the birthday party. She didn't throw the cake back. She didn't post a furious response when the video went viral. She walked inside, cleaned her son's face before her own, and started building. That is not weakness. That is the most disciplined form of strength there is. It takes more courage to be still when everything in you wants to explode than it does to just let it all out. Claire understood, maybe not consciously, maybe just in her bones, that her moment was coming. And she was going to be standing on solid ground when it arrived. So if you are someone who has been told that your quietness means you don't care, that your patience means you've accepted defeat, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not losing. You are loading. If this story reached you today, if any part of Claire's journey felt less like fiction and more like a mirror, please don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell me which lesson hit you the hardest. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is your sign. Every week, we bring you stories like this one. Stories about quiet strength, about consequences that build slowly and land hard, and about people who found their way back to themselves when everything else tried to push them away. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.